The Pittsburgh gray was a weight. It wasn't just the persistent drizzle that defined an Appalachian autumn, but the color of old steel, of the sky, and of the mood. Jake Callahan gripped the steering wheel of his pickup, his knuckles white, as he navigated the midday traffic out of the city. He was heading east, toward the rugged, cleansing peaks of the Allegheny Mountains. Jake Callahan was a man built for action, a senior chief in the Navy SEALs. At 34, his body was a lean, disciplined map of capability. But his eyes, a sharp hazel, held a weariness that went far beyond the physical. He was on mandatory leave. Required psychological reset, his superiors had called it, after an operation in Yemen went sideways. Jake called it a cage. The stillness was excruciating. He didn't know how to exist without a mission, and the teams were the only mission he'd ever known. Beside him in the passenger seat was his only companion. Ruger, a regal 4-year-old German shepherd, watched the gray city slide by. Ruger's coat was a rich black and tan, and his intelligent eyes missed nothing. He was Jake's shadow, trained to a standard that mirrored his own, and the dog served as a grounding presence in a world that often felt detached and unreal. As the truck climbed into the rolling hills, the city's oppressive damp finally broke, giving way to a bright but cold autumn sun. The air rushing through the open window changed, losing the smell of exhaust and wet pavement, replaced by the sharp, restorative scent of pine and cold stone. Jake felt some of the tension in his shoulders release. This was what he needed, not therapy, just silence. He parked at a deserted trailhead, a spot known only to locals and serious hikers. He slung a light tactical pack over his shoulders, more out of habit than necessity, filled with water, survival gear, and a heavy-duty multi-tool. Ruger leapt from the truck, his paws landing softly on the pine needle-covered ground, his tail giving a single, controlled wag. "All right, buddy," Jake murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Let's go see the reservoir." They moved through the forest in an easy, practiced silence. Jake's boots made almost no sound on the damp earth. The Allegheny wilderness was vast, a sprawling expanse of old-growth hemlock, sheer granite faces, and hidden valleys. It was the one place his mind truly went quiet. The constant, hyper-vigilant hum receded, and the roar in his ears, the phantom echo of helicopter rotors and gunfire, faded to a distant buzz. He thought about the mission, the extraction, the heat and the dust. Impossible choices made in a split second. He was supposed to decompress, but the adrenaline had nowhere to go. It coiled in his gut, making him restless and irritable. He was a weapon without a target, and it was wearing him down. After 2 hours of steady climbing, they reached the ridge overlooking the Kinswa Basin Reservoir. Jake stopped, his breath catching for a reason other than the altitude. He'd been coming to this spot for years, a pristine, remote body of water fed by mountain runoff. It should have been full, a deep sapphire blue. Instead, the reservoir was a ghost of itself. A severe summer drought had ravaged the region, and the water level had dropped by at least 40 feet. What was once a forested shoreline now ended abruptly, revealing a massive, sloping belt of pale, cracked earth and skeletal tree stumps. The reservoir was critically low, a muddy shadow of its former glory. Ruger seemed to sense the wrongness of it, staying close to Jake's leg instead of scouting ahead. They made their way down the newly treacherous slope to the water's edge, their boots sinking slightly into the exposed, drying mudflats. The air smelled of decay, of damp earth and dying vegetation exposed to the sun for the first time in decades. Jake stood at the water's edge, staring at the unnatural landscape. He felt a strange resonance with the lake. He, too, felt drained, exposed, with things surfacing that were supposed to stay buried deep. He was lost in thought when Ruger's demeanor abruptly changed. The dog went rigid, his body a straight, hard line. A low, menacing growl rumbled in his chest, a sound Jake hadn't heard since their last training exercise. "Ruger, what is it?" Jake's voice was sharp. The haze of his leave vanished, replaced by the ice-cold focus of a seal. His eyes scanned the perimeter. Nothing. No movement, no human threat. Ruger ignored him. He moved forward, out onto the mudflats, to a spot about 50 yards from the water's edge. He started barking. Not a warning, but a frantic, urgent alarm. He began to dig, his powerful front paws tearing at the thick, heavy mud. "Stand down," Jake commanded, but the dog was locked on. Jake's own instincts took over. He moved quickly toward Ruger, his hand brushing the hilt of the K-bar knife strapped to his belt. "What did you find, boy?" He saw it as he got closer. Sticking out of the gray-black mud was a perfect 90-degree corner of rusted metal. It was a dark, industrial green, the corner of something very large and man-made. It looked like the edge of a big shipping container. Ruger was clawing at a seam, a gap that looked like a door. Jake dropped to one knee, his jeans sinking into the muck. He gently pushed the dog back. Easy. Let me. He pulled the multi-tool from his pack, deploying the heavy pry bar. He jammed it into the crack Ruger had indicated. The mud had created a powerful vacuum seal. He put his weight into it, his muscles straining. The metal groaned in protest, but it held. This wasn't enough. He needed leverage. He scanned the line of debris and found a thick, heavy log half buried nearby. Propping it against a rock, he used it as a lever against the container door. He gave a single, powerful, controlled push. There was a sharp crack followed by a sickeningly pressurized hiss as the seal broke. The stench hit him first. It wasn't the simple mud and decay of the lake. It was the thick, unmistakable, gut-turning miasma of death. Jake recoiled, throwing an arm over his nose and mouth. Ruger whined, backing away. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. This was no accident. This was a tomb. He clicked on the high-lumen flashlight from his pack. The beam, sharp as a scalpel, cut into the container's absolute blackness. The light found the first body. It was a skeleton, slumped against the far wall, dressed in the tattered remains of civilian clothing. Before he could process that, the beam moved and found the second. This one was sprawled near the door as if it had been trying to get out. Jake forced himself to mouth breathe, stepping halfway into the container. The floor was slick with mud and slime, but it wasn't empty. Stacked neatly in the back were dozens of heavy, military-grade weapons cases. He knew the markings. He recognized the specialized locks. This wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a cache. These weren't hunting rifles. They were high-tech, short-barreled rifles with suppressors, advanced optics, and encrypted communications gear. His light moved from the weapons back to the skeletons, then to the black maw of the doorway. The silence of the mountains rushed back in, but it was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, watchful, and menacing. Jake Callahan stood frozen in the mud, the cold mountain air doing nothing to stop the sweat trickling down his back. His search for peace was over. His mandatory leave had just ended. Jake backed away from the dark, cold container, the stench of death clinging to his clothes. He placed a steadying hand on Ruger's neck, the dog's muscles still corded with tension. The silence of the reservoir was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of the low water and the distant cry of a hawk. His mind, trained for rapid assessment, was cataloging the impossibilities. 2 bodies, state-of-the-art weapons, and a location that suggested a deliberate and long-held secret. He was weighing his options, none of them good, when Ruger's head snapped toward the ridge. The dog didn't growl, but his body went stiff. "Company?" Jake whispered. Jake moved fluidly behind the relative cover of a large, skeletal stump. A moment later, a figure appeared, moving down the steep, muddy embankment. It was a woman, and she moved with the confident, economic stride of someone who owned the terrain. She wore the dark green and gray uniform of the National Park Service. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense braid. She was in her mid-30s with a lean, fit build and a face defined by sharp, intelligent lines. Her eyes, currently narrowed, took in the bizarre scene below. The intruder, the big German shepherd, and the half-buried shipping container. Her hand rested naturally on the holstered pistol at her hip. "This is a restricted area," she called out, her voice clear and firm, carrying easily in the thin air. She stopped about 30 yards away, maintaining a safe distance. "The reservoir bed is off limits to the public." Jake slowly rose from his crouch, his hands clearly visible. "I know, my dog found something. I didn't intend to hike down here." Her gaze was analytical, suspicious. She noted his military-style boots, his coiled posture, and the intense focus of the dog. "I'm Ranger Garcia. I need you and your dog to move back up to the ridge. Now." "I can't do that, Ranger," Jake said, his tone even. He had seconds to assess her. She was alert, professional, and armed. He decided on a calculated truth. "You need to see this, and you need to see it before you call it in." Ava's eyes flicked to the container, her suspicion deepening. "See what?" "Back away from the container, sir. Keep your hands where I can see them." "The name's Jake Callahan," he said, taking a step to the side, farther from the container's door. "I'm on leave. Navy. What's in there isn't a civilian matter, and I don't think it's a local one either." The mention of the Navy gave her pause. It explained his bearing, but not his presence. She moved closer, her eyes still locked on him, then on Ruger. The dog sat perfectly still, a silent statue of disciplined menace. Ava took a breath, her training taking over, and shifted her focus to the object. She approached the container from the side, her hand never leaving her weapon. She didn't need to look inside. The smell emanating from the dark opening told the story. The color drained from her face, but her voice was steady. "What's in there?" "Two people, long dead," Jake said, "and a cache of high-end weaponry, enough to outfit a small assault team." Ava swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. This was her mountain. She'd patrolled this area for 12 years. She thought she knew every secret it held. She drew her service flashlight and shined its powerful beam into the darkness, illuminating the grim scene Jake had described. The stark white of bone, the dark, oily shapes of rifles stacked in cases. She turned back to Jake, her suspicion replaced by a shared horror. "We have to report this. County Sheriff, the FBI." "Wait," Jake said. He pointed to the mud near the threshold, just inside the container door. "I saw this right before you arrived." He knelt and used a long, thin stick to pry an object from the thick mud. It was a ruggedized, olive-drab GPS unit. The screen was cracked and caked with mud, but the casing was intact. He turned it over in his hand. Molded into the hard plastic back was a stylized logo of a Spartan helmet over 2 letters. He wiped away the grime. "AD." Jake looked up at Ava, expecting a blank look. Instead, her reaction was visceral. The color vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden, cold fury. "AD," she repeated, her voice a whisper. "You know it," Jake stated. "Aegis Dynamics," she said, her voice trembling with a sudden, contained rage. "Everyone in Pittsburgh knows the name. Donovan Reed, the aerospace billionaire. He builds stealth drones. Next-gen tech. He's the city's golden boy. His main R&D campus borders the National Forest, not 10 miles north of here." She stared at the GPS unit in Jake's hand, her mind clearly racing. "Ava, you look like you've seen a ghost," Jake said softly. She met his gaze, and he saw the professional mask crack, revealing something deeply personal. "My father, David Garcia, was the head ranger here for 30 years, she said, her voice tight. "He died 5 years ago. They called it a heart attack, but for the last 2 years of his life, he was obsessed with Aegis Dynamics." Jake remained silent, listening. Reed was buying up land, pushing the boundaries. "My dad believed they were running illegal operations inside the park line. He documented low-altitude flights, heavy vehicles on restricted roads, strange radio interference. He filed dozens of reports." She let out a bitter laugh. "They buried him in paperwork. AD's lawyers called him a senile old man. His superiors told him to stop harassing Pittsburgh's biggest philanthropist. They discredited him. It broke him. He always said they were doing something dark out here, something that was poisoning the park. He could never find the proof." She looked from the GPS in Jake's hand to the dark tomb of the container. "I think you just found it." A deep, heavy silence settled between them. The implications were terrifying. This wasn't a simple murder. This was a corporate conspiracy run by a man with unlimited money and political cover. "We can't call the county sheriff," Jake said quietly, testing her. "No," Ava agreed instantly, her resolve hardening. "The sheriff's department gets a very large annual donation from the Reed Foundation. If we report this, that GPS unit disappears. This container gets declared a military training accident, and we both get buried." Jake nodded, a grim respect for her quick assessment forming. She was tough, smart, and now she was motivated. "My father's station," she said, thinking aloud. "It's nearby. It has his old logs. Maybe he found more than he realized." "All right," Jake said. The decision was made. This was his mission now. "We do it your way. We secure this, and we see what your father knew." Ava looked at him, then at Ruger, a strange and unexpected alliance forming on the muddy shores of the dying lake. "First," she said, gesturing to the open door. "We have to hide this. We hide it, and we hide that we were ever here." Jake picked up the heavy log he'd used as a lever. "Let's get to work, Ranger." It took nearly an hour of cold, grueling work. Jake and Ava moved with a grim, shared purpose, their breath pluming in the crisp air. They used Jake's heavy log to lever the container's massive door shut. The groan of the metal was painfully loud, echoing across the drained reservoir. When it closed, the hiss of the seal locking was almost as disturbing. They worked without speaking, gathering rocks, dragging waterlogged deadfall, and shoveling wet mud to cover the metal scar on the landscape. They meticulously erased their own footprints, using pine boughs to smooth the mud. When they were finished, the container was once again invisible, hidden by a facade of natural debris. It was a shallow grave, resealed. They won't find it unless they know exactly where to look, Jake said, his voice low. He stood and offered a hand to Ava, pulling her to her feet. Her hands were caked in mud, her face set in a grim mask. But they will be looking, Ava said, wiping her hands on her pants. If that GPS unit goes offline, Aegis Dynamics is going to send a recovery team. We're on a clock. We need more information, Jake agreed. We split up. You go to your father's station, find those logs. I'll head back to my cabin, pack a go bag, and start digging into Reed's digital footprint. My truck is too exposed at the trailhead. I'll move it. Ava nodded. My station is 5 miles east. It's high altitude, off-grid, defensible. There's an old logging road 2 miles north of your trailhead. Meet me there. At dawn. Dawn, Jake confirmed. Ava gave a sharp whistle. Ruger, who had taken up a sentry position on the ridge, looked to Jake. Go with her, Jake commanded. Watch. Ruger's ears perked, but he obeyed, trotting to Ava's side. He trusts you, Ava said, surprised, placing a hand on the dog's head. He trusts my judgment, Jake corrected. He'll keep you safe on the trail. I'll meet you both at the logging road. Ava held his gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous pact they had just made. Then she turned and vanished into the dense woods, Ruger moving at her heel like a silent, four-legged shadow. Jake hiked alone back to his truck. The woods, just hours ago his sanctuary, now felt hostile. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves high in the canopy was a potential threat. The quiet peace had been replaced by the cold, sharp vigilance of an operator. He scanned the trees, analyzing the terrain for ambush points, and moved with a deadly silence. He was no longer a man on leave. He was a man behind enemy lines. He reached his truck, checked it for any signs of tampering, and drove it deep into the forest, concealing it in a thick copse of trees half a mile from the logging road Ava had designated. Then he began the long, 2-hour trek back to his rental cabin, moving parallel to the main trail, but deep in the cover of the tall trees. The cabin was a small, rustic A-frame, isolated on a wooded lot 20 miles from the reservoir. It was perfect for solitude. It was terrible for defense. He approached it in a wide circle, observing for a full 20 minutes. No vehicles, no smoke from the chimney, no broken branches or new boot prints. It looked clean. He entered from the back, pistol drawn, clearing each room in a fluid, practiced motion. Empty. Only then did he give a low whistle, and Ruger, having silently returned from his escort duty, padded into the cabin and took up a guard post by the front door. Jake locked the doors, drew the curtains, and got to work. He built a small fire in the hearth, more to chase away the damp chill than for comfort. He pulled out his ruggedized, encrypted laptop and a compact satellite transceiver. Within minutes he was connected to a secure server, his digital presence cloaked, and he started digging. Aegis Dynamics. Donovan Reed. The public information was spotless. Reed was Pittsburgh's tech king, a philanthropist who funded hospitals, universities, and environmental causes. He was charismatic, brilliant, and seemingly untouchable. His company, AD, held billions in defense contracts. Jake went deeper, past the public facade. He accessed private intelligence feeds, scanning manifests for AD's private security force. It was a small army, staffed almost exclusively by ex-special forces and private military contractors. He found shell corporations, offshore accounts, and a complex web of logistics companies. A cold, familiar anger began to build in his chest. This wasn't a simple arms deal. This was a shadow operation running parallel to the legitimate business. Reed was playing both sides. He was arming someone, and the 2 skeletons in the container were the price of keeping that secret. Jake had left Yemen to get away from this. He'd come to these mountains to silence the ghosts of men exactly like Donovan Reed, men who built empires on chaos. And the war had followed him home. He was so focused on the glowing screen, tracing a weapons shipment from a warehouse in Erie to a blacklisted port, that he almost missed the signal. It wasn't a sound. It was the absence of one. Ruger, who had been dozing by the door, was on his feet. He wasn't growling. He wasn't barking. He stood perfectly still, head cocked, a statue of silent concentration. Jake's hand moved, powering down the laptop. The cabin was plunged into darkness, lit only by the faint, flickering glow of the embers in the fireplace. "Show me," Jake whispered. Ruger moved silently to the front window. Jake slid from his chair, pistol in hand, and moved to the wall beside the window. He peered through a tiny gap in the curtains. His blood ran cold. 4 figures were moving through the trees in a perfect diamond formation. They were dressed in black, full tactical gear, night vision goggles casting an alien green glow. They carried suppressed, short-barreled rifles. They weren't cops. They weren't amateurs. They were professionals. They were his own kind. Jake's mind went quiet and sharp. They were here for him. They already knew. He moved to the center of the cabin. Watch the back. The dog instantly repositioned, his eyes glued to the rear door. Jake pulled his rifle from its case and slung his go bag, always packed with essentials, over his shoulder. He checked the round in his rifle's chamber. He heard the faint click of a breaching charge being placed on the back door. They weren't planning on talking. The team leader, a broad-shouldered man who moved with a terrifying fluidity, gave a hand signal. Two men moved to the front. Jake wasn't going to be flushed out. He had to dictate the fight. Now, Ruger! He yelled. He brought his rifle to the ceiling and fired a 3-round burst, a deafening roar in the small space. It was a signal of chaos designed to confuse them, to make them think he was panicking. As the operators outside flinched, Jake shattered the side window with the butt of his rifle. Ruger, go! Go! Ruger launched himself through the broken window. A black streak disappearing into the darkness. Jake followed a millisecond later, rolling as he hit the pine needle-covered ground. The back door blew inward. The front door was kicked open. Targets mobile. Egress the side. A voice yelled. Bullets tore through the night. The thudding coughs of suppressed rounds, ripping chunks of bark from the tree Jake was using for cover. He didn't return fire. He didn't engage. He was escaping. He ran, weaving through the old-growth hemlocks, Ruger running parallel 20 yards to his left. He heard them crashing after him, but they were slower. This was his terrain. He reached a small ridge and looked back. The team leader had stopped. He wasn't pursuing. He raised his rifle, but not at Jake. He fired a single flare into the open window of the cabin. To Jake's horror, the old, dry timber cabin went up instantly. The structure erupted like a matchbox. The fire roared into the night sky, a pillar of orange that would illuminate the forest for miles. Jake and Ruger watched from the darkness. The cabin was a total loss. His gear, his laptop, all gone. But it was the message that was the most terrifying. They hadn't just come to kill him. They'd come to erase him. The fire wasn't a warning. It was a statement. You were never here. The forest was dark and cold. The only light came from the hellish orange glow of his burning cabin, now a distant column of smoke against the star-filled sky. Jake Callahan ran for 3 miles. Ruger a silent shadow beside him, before he finally allowed himself to stop. He leaned against a massive old-growth pine, his chest heaving, not from exertion, but from a cold, focused rage. They had been thorough. They hadn't just attacked. They had erased. They had destroyed his gear, his truck, his temporary home. They had assumed he was inside. It was a tactical, emotionless purge. He dropped his go bag to the ground. It was all he had left. A pistol with 2 spare magazines, the sat phone, a knife, a med kit, and water, his rifle, his encrypted laptop, were all gone. He powered on the satellite phone, his fingers moving stiffly in the cold. The logging road was compromised. The fire would draw attention, and that road was the most logical escape. His attackers would be watching it. He needed a new plan, a new location. He sent a message to Ava's satellite emergency beacon. A simple, pre-arranged code. RVL4. Urgent. L4 was the old fire lookout on Thunder Peak, the highest point in this section of the park. It was remote, hard to access, and offered a 360-degree view. He got a simple copy 2 minutes later. All right, Ruger, Jake whispered, his voice hoarse. New plan. We're going high. The trek to the lookout was brutal. It was another 4 miles and the trail was almost vertical. He moved at a relentless, punishing pace, his anger fueling him. Ruger, tireless and alert, ranged ahead, his paws silent on the rocky path, his form melting in and out of the pre-dawn shadows. Jake's mind worked, stripping away the shock, analyzing the facts. Reed's security force wasn't just ex-military. They were good. They'd found his unlisted rental cabin in a matter of hours. This meant they had assets, probably inside the local town, watching. They were hunting him and they weren't going to stop. As the first faint, bruised purple light of dawn touched the eastern sky, he reached the summit. The air was thin and bitingly cold. The lookout tower was a relic from another era. A single 14 by 14 foot room perched on 40-foot wooden stilts, its large glass windows facing every direction. A figure stepped out from the shadows at the base of the tower. Ava. She had a rifle slung over her shoulder and a heavy pack at her feet. When she saw him, her professional mask broke for a second, replaced by a wave of profound relief. "I saw the fire," she said, her voice strained. "The glow, I thought." "I'm okay," Jake said, cutting her off, not wanting to talk about it. They were fast. A 4-man team, full tactical. He looked at her pack. "You made it to your station?" "I did." She unzipped the heavy canvas pack. I thought you might be cold." She pulled out a thick, worn flannel shirt, soft with age, and a thermos. "It was my dad's. And this is coffee, hot." Jake stopped. He was soaked with sweat and it was rapidly turning to ice. His own clothes were torn from the escape. He looked at the simple, kind offering. It was a gesture that cut through his hardened, tactical mind. He nodded, his throat tight, and took the shirt. He stripped off his damp jacket and pulled on the warm, dry flannel. It smelled faintly of cedar and soap. He took the metal cup of coffee she poured, the steam rising in the cold air. The heat was a shock, grounding him. "Thank you, Ava." "We're in this together, Jake," she said softly. "Now look what I found." They climbed the narrow, creaking stairs into the small glass room of the lookout. It was Spartan, a small cot, a map table, and an old, disconnected radio console. The view, however, was magnificent. The entire national forest spread out below them, a sea of green and gray ridges, all under a vast, clearing sky. Ava laid a worn, leather-bound journal on the map table. "This was my dad's private log, not the official one, the one he kept for himself." She opened it. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting. It was a meticulous record of years of observation. Jake's eyes widened. David Garcia had been more than a ranger. He was an intelligence analyst. "He logged every flight," Ava said, her finger tracing a line on a hand-drawn map. AD helicopters, always unmarked black Sikorskys. They claimed atmospheric testing, but they always flew low, always deviated from their registered flight plans, and always inside the park boundary. And look, she pointed to the map. Her father had marked every sighting. Dozens of X's, all forming a dense, unmistakable cluster. "They were all circling one location," Jake said, his voice flat. "The reservoir," Ava finished. "For 3 years. He knew they were using it. He just didn't know what was in it." She turned a page. "And there's this." He was a radio hobbyist. He started scanning their frequencies. He found encrypted data bursts. Always at night, always coinciding with the chopper sightings. She pointed to a series of notations. He wrote them down. He said they sounded like chirps. Jake looked at the notations, then at Ava. The respect he felt for her was immense. She wasn't just strong, she was brave, continuing a fight that had cost her father everything. He saw the same stubborn, defiant spark in her that he recognized in himself. "Your father was a good man, Ava. A very good man." "He was," she whispered, her eyes shining for a brief moment before she blinked it away. "Back to business. The question is what now? Your gear's gone. They're hunting us. We have my dad's notes and what's in our heads. It's not enough." "It's enough to make them nervous," Jake said, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "Enough to make them keep looking, which means they'll make a mistake." As he spoke, Ava, who had instinctively been scanning the park with her radio, froze, her fingers tightening on the dial. "Jake, listen." She turned up the volume. A faint, rhythmic sound came from the speaker. It wasn't static. It was a digital chirp. Chirp, chirp. "That's it," Ava breathed, her face pale. "That's the sound my dad wrote about." Jake's head snapped up. His own, trained ears had caught the sound outside the radio. A faint, high-pitched whine, almost imperceptible, like a distant insect. He grabbed the binoculars from Ava's pack and scanned the next ridge over, about 2 miles to the north. "They're not just listening," he said, his voice deadly calm. He'd found it. A dark, bird-sized shape hovering against the morning sky. "Thermal drone," he said. "They're scanning the peaks. They're hunting us, and we're in a glass box on the highest point for 10 miles. The radio chirped again, faster this time, as if it had just tagged a target. "We have to go," Ava said, already stuffing the journal into her pack. "Now." They didn't wait for the drone to get closer. They were out of the glass box and scrambling down the tower's rickety wooden legs before the whine of its motors grew any louder. Jake hit the ground with Ava right behind him. "This way," she commanded, not waiting for his input. She was in her element, and he trusted her. She plunged off the summit, following what was less a trail than a controlled slide down a steep scree slope. Using stunted pine trees for handholds and cover, Jake followed, his body automatically adjusting to the treacherous terrain. Ruger moved beside him with the easy four-legged grace of a creature born to it, his claws digging in for purchase. They moved fast, putting distance between them and the exposed peak. The high-pitched sound of the drone faded, but they both knew it was a temporary reprieve. They were being hunted by a force with superior technology and numbers. They found refuge in a deep, ancient ravine carved by millennia of snowmelt. A thick canopy of old-growth cedars blotted out the sky, creating a pocket of deep green twilight. It would shield them from thermal imaging, for now. Jake leaned against the moss-covered rock wall, his lungs burning. Ava bent over, gasping for breath, her face pale but determined. "We can't keep running," Jake said, his voice raspy. He was already thinking, his mind assembling the tactical problem. "We're in their territory. They've got air support, trackers. They'll have us cornered before dark." "So what do we do, Jake?" Ava asked, her voice strained. "We have no gear, no backup. My father's notes are just notes. It's not proof." "No," Jake agreed, his eyes hardening. "It's not, but I know where the proof is." Ava looked at him, her expression turning to disbelief. "You can't be serious. The container, Jake, that's the one place they will have locked down. It's ground zero. It'll be crawling with them." "No, you're wrong," Jake said, his mind working fast. "Think like them. They're the hunters. They just flushed their prey off the highest point in the area. They think we're running away from the container. They'll have a perimeter, but their focus, their sweep, is going to be moving outward, trying to catch us. They won't expect us to turn back. They won't expect us to run into the trap." He looked at her, his gaze intense. "That container isn't just a tomb, Ava. It's a vault. Reed's guys are operators, not idiots. They wouldn't leave high-tech weapons in a box in a lake without manifests, without data. The weapons are just the hardware. The why, the who, that's the real treasure, and it's in there." Ava stared at him, seeing the absolute, unshakable conviction in his eyes. He was right. It was the most dangerous move they could make, and for that very reason, it just might work. "All right," she said, taking a deep breath. "But we can't take the main trails. We can't even take the game trails. They'll be watching." She pointed to the ravine wall. "There's a way. It's not on any map. My dad showed it to me once. He said the native tribes used it to move between the high country and the water. He called it the spine of the ridge. It's hard and it's dangerous, but they won't be on it. Lead the way, Ranger." For the next 2 hours, they moved through a landscape Jake would have never found on his own. Ava led them along a barely there path that ran along the bony spine of a long, jagged ridge, hidden from the valleys below. It was a goat path, a narrow walkway of scree and wind-stunted pines. This was her world. She moved with a silent, fluid confidence, reading the terrain in a way Jake could only admire. She was a part of the mountain. He, in turn, became the guardian. His head was on a constant swivel, his senses alert, watching their back trail, listening for the whine of a drone, the snap of a twig. They stopped once to drink from a small, clear spring bubbling from the rock. "He used to bring me up here," Ava said quietly, a catch in her voice. "My dad, he said it was the only place you could feel the mountain's heartbeat." Jake watched her. He saw the pain she carried, the quiet strength that came from it. He understood her fight. It was for her home, for her father's memory. It gave her a resolve that no amount of military training could replicate. "He'd be proud of you, Ava," Jake said, his voice gentle. She met his eyes, a silent, grateful acknowledgement passing between them. They reached the ridge overlooking the reservoir in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, dramatic shadows across the exposed mudflats. The place was silent. Too silent. Jake took the binoculars from Ava's pack and spent 10 minutes scanning the entire basin. "There," he whispered, focusing on the opposite ridge, the one closest to the AD campus. "2 men, a sniper and a spotter. They're dug in." Ava tensed. "Jake, we can't." "It's okay," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "They're in a nest, and they're looking away from us. They're watching the high peaks, the escape routes, just like I thought. They're waiting for the beaters to flush us down to them." He focused on the container's location. "The site itself, it's clean. They've left it alone. They think it's secure." "So how do we get down there?" "That's 1,000 feet of open mud," Ava said. "We use the shadows," Jake said. "We use the embankment. We go right now while the sun is in their eyes. Stay low. No sudden movements." "Ruger," he whispered. "Low crawl. The dog immediately dropped to its belly, his body tense. They moved down the slope, half sliding, half crawling, using the deep gullies created by water runoff as trenches. It was slow, agonizing work. Every pebble they dislodged felt like an avalanche. But Jake had been right. The Overwatch team was focused on the distant peaks, their backs to the lake bed. They reached the container. It was exactly as they had left it. Jake and Ava put their shoulders to the heavy log, their muscles straining. The door groaned open. "Ava, watch the ridge." "Watch the door," Jake commanded. He plunged into the foul darkness, the beam of his small flashlight cutting through the black. He ignored the skeletons, ignored the weapons. He went straight for the large, marked communications case he'd seen before. He ran his gloved hands along the inside, feeling for a seam, a difference in texture. There, a false panel in the back, held by 4 magnetic pressure locks. He jammed his knife into the seam and pried. The panel popped off with a soft thud. Behind it, nestled in custom-cut, thick black foam, was a silver, waterproof hard case, no bigger than a lunchbox. His heart pounded. He pulled it out, popped the latches, and opened it. 6 solid-state data drives. "This is it, Ava," he breathed, backing out of the container, case in hand. "This is everything." He stepped out into the dying sunlight, a feeling of grim triumph washing over him. Ruger's whine shattered the moment, a low, desperate sound from deep in his chest. "Move!" Jake yelled, shoving Ava toward the shore. A distorted, metallic voice boomed across the reservoir from a bullhorn. "Nowhere to run, Callahan. We've been waiting for you." Jake looked up. On the ridge they had just left, 2 black-clad figures stood, rifles at the ready. He looked across the reservoir. The sniper team was no longer looking away. They were aiming right at them. He looked toward the water's edge. 2 more operators who had been concealed in the mud and reeds were rising, forming the final part of the trap. They were in a perfect, 4-sided kill box. A high-velocity round hissed past Jake's ear, so close he felt the air move, and slammed into the metal container. The impact was a deafening, terrifying ping that echoed across the empty lake. The hunt was over. The execution was about to begin. The world exploded in a terrifying ping. The high-velocity round that slammed into the container next to Jake's head was a deafening, violent gong. Rusted metal shrapnel sprayed inward, stinging his cheek. Ava cried out, hitting the deck as Ruger flattened himself beside her, a furious growl rumbling in his chest. "They played us." Jake spat, his mind racing, processing the trap. "They knew we'd come back. This was a baited kill box." Another shot hissed overhead. A third sent up a geyser of mud where he had just been standing. The sniper team had them pinned. The operators on the ridges were moving, descending, tightening the noose. "We can't go up," Ava yelled, her voice tight with fear. "They're on all sides." "Then we go down." Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her behind the minimal cover of the container. He pointed to the far end of the reservoir, where a thick, green line of trees marked a deep channel. "The river, the outflow. Is it deep?" "The Allegheny," Ava nodded, her mind catching up. "Yes, it flows north from here. It's deep and it's fast. Ice melt. Is there cover? Willows? Alders? A thicket?" "Jake, there's a boat, a Ranger cache, an inflatable Zodiac for swift water rescue. It's hidden about 100 yards into the outflow." Jake didn't hesitate. He stuffed the silver hard case into his go bag, zipping it tight. He looked at Ava, his eyes locking with hers. The hazel was gone, replaced by the cold steel of an operator. "Here's what we do. We run. You, me, we run straight for that thicket. Don't look back. Don't stop. I'll be right behind you. Got it?" "Got it," she breathed. "Heel," he commanded. The dog pressed against his leg. "On my go." Jake broke cover first, running low, firing his pistol toward the team on the nearest ridge. Pop, pop, pop. The small caliber rounds were useless for accuracy at this range. But they were movement. They were a distraction. They made the operators duck. "Ava, go." She burst from cover, sprinting across the sucking mudflats. It was like running in wet cement. Every step was a battle. Ruger ran at her side, a blur of black and tan, his body instinctively shielding her. The air tore apart. The operators, realizing their prey was breaking the perimeter, opened up. The sniper rounds were precise cracks. The rifle fire was a heavy-duty rattle. Bullets ripped through the mud around their feet, hissing through the air like angry hornets. Jake was last, moving backward, firing controlled pairs, forcing the operators to engage him, drawing their fire from Ava. A round zipped past his ear, and he felt its heat. 50 more yards. Ava screamed, her lungs on fire. Jake saw the tactical canoes. 2 of them, sleek and black, emerging from the river mouth, cutting off their escape. They had a water team. Of course they did. The team leader, the broad-shouldered man Jake recognized from the cabin, stood in the lead boat. He wasn't some random contractor. Jake knew his face. Cade Thorne, an ex-SEAL kicked out for running Black Ops. This wasn't just Reed's security. This was undeniable, professional execution squad. No boat, Jake yelled, changing the plan. Into the trees, hide. He shoved Ava toward the thick wall of willows at the river's bank. They crashed through the branches and tumbled down a short mud bank into the ice-cold water of the Allegheny River. The cold was a physical blow, stealing their breath. The current was powerful, immediately grabbing at their legs. The boat, Jake. It's here. Ava clawed at a camouflage tarp, revealing the gray, inflatable Zodiac. Jake and Ava tore at the mooring lines, pulling the heavy boat into the current. Ruger leapt in, his fur already soaked, his eyes glued to the bank. Get in. Jake shoved Ava over the side. He pushed the boat into the main current and vaulted in after her, landing hard on the aluminum floor. He scrambled to the small outboard motor at the stern. Thorne and his team were on the bank. 20 yards away, leveling their rifles. Jake yanked the starter cord. The engine sputtered, choked, and died. Jake. Ava screamed. Ruger launched himself at the side of the boat, barking with terrifying ferocity. A solid wall of protective rage. Jake yanked the cord again. The engine caught, a weak whine. Not enough. Thorne's team opened fire. Bullets punched through the inflatable pontoons. Hiss, hiss. The boat began to list, air screaming from 2 punctures. Jake threw himself over the motor, shielding it, and pulled the cord a 3rd time. The engine roared to life. He slammed the throttle forward, and the boat surged into the current. The 2 tactical canoes, faster and more maneuverable, shot out from the bank in pursuit. They were gaining. They're faster than us, Ava yelled over the wind and the roar of the engine. And we're sinking. The river narrowed, becoming a canyon of white water. Roiling rapids churned ahead. Jake fought the tiller, trying to steer the lurching, deflating boat through the standing waves. 1 canoe pulled alongside. An operator in the bow, raising his rifle. Ruger, needing no command, leapt across the gap, his jaws aimed for the man's weapon. He hit the man in the chest, a 70-pound missile of pure muscle. The man screamed, firing his rifle uselessly into the sky as he and the dog tumbled into the fierce, cold water. Ruger. Jake yelled, his heart stopping. There. Ava pointed. Ruger's head broke the surface, swimming powerfully against the current, heading for the bank. He was safe, but the distraction had cost them. The second canoe, driven by Thorne, was upon them. Thorne wasn't aiming for them. He was aiming for the engine. He fired twice. The first shot missed. The second slammed into the engine's metal housing. Bang! Ava, who was leaning against the console, cried out. A sharp, terrible sound. She slumped against the side of the boat. Jake looked over. She was clutching her shoulder. A dark, arterial red was pulsing between her fingers. It wasn't a bullet. A piece of the engine casing, a jagged shard of shrapnel, had blown out and buried itself deep in her shoulder. Her face was white, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Something inside Jake broke. The cold, tactical operator vanished, replaced by a white-hot, protective rage. He looked at Ava, bleeding out. He looked at Thorne, reloading, a cold smirk on his face. Hold on. Jake roared. He didn't turn from the fight. He turned into it. He wrenched the tiller, ramming their failing, deflating boat directly into the side of Thorne's tactical canoe. The impact was violent. He then slammed the throttle to full, pinning Thorne's boat against a large, jagged rock in the middle of the rapids. Thorne's boat, caught between the rock and Jake's Zodiac, folded with a sickening crack of fiberglass. The operators were thrown into the churning white water. Jake didn't wait to see them go under. He aimed his dying boat for the far shore, a mess of boulders and fallen trees. He held the throttle wide open, hitting the bank with a bone-jarring crash. The boat was done. The chase, for the moment, was over. But Ava was bleeding badly. The impact was bone-jarring. The inflatable boat, its last breath hissing out, slammed into the rocky shore and collapsed. Jake was moving before it stopped. He scooped Ava into his arms, her body frighteningly light, and pushed through the dense curtain of undergrowth. Ava, stay with me. Talk to me. Where? he commanded, his voice tight with adrenaline. She was fading, her face ashen, her lips tinged blue from the freezing water. She pointed weakly along the shoreline toward the sheer cliff of the canyon. Waterfall, she whispered. Behind it, a dry cave. My father. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He pushed through the trees, the ground underfoot a morass of mud and river stone. He could hear shouting from the rapids behind them. Thorne's team was trying to regroup. They had minutes, maybe less. A wet whine came from their left. Ruger burst through the brush, his coat matted, his eyes wild. He had made it ashore. He immediately took the lead as if he understood, guiding them toward the sound of falling water. It was a small, roaring curtain of white water, a tributary spilling down from the ridge above. It looked solid, but Ruger disappeared right through it. Jake followed, plunging through the cold, deafening spray. Behind the waterfall was a shallow, dry cave, not 20 feet deep. The roar of the water outside was a vibrating, deafening wall of sound, sealing them in. It was a perfect acoustic shield. Jake gently laid Ava on the cold stone floor, using his go bag as a pillow. He stripped off his own wet jacket and laid it over her, a poor substitute for a blanket. Ruger, shaking off the ice water, immediately lay down beside her, a living, breathing furnace, his eyes glued to the cave's watery entrance. All right, let me see. Jake's voice was different. The operator's rasp was gone, replaced by the low, calm, focused tone of a medic. He pulled the first aid kit from his bag. With a practiced, impersonal motion, he used his shears to cut away the heavy flannel shirt and the layers beneath, exposing the wound. It was ugly. The shrapnel, a jagged black triangle of metal, was buried deep in the muscle and tissue of her shoulder, just above the collarbone. Blood pulsed, steady and dark. You're lucky, he murmured, his hands already working. It missed the artery, but it's deep. This is going to hurt. Just do it, she breathed, her teeth chattering. Jake worked with an almost brutal efficiency, yet his hands were incredibly gentle. He poured saline from his water bottle to flush the wound, his fingers probing the edges to check the depth. He packed it with compression gauze, applying direct, firm pressure. Ava cried out, a sharp, stifled sound, her body arching off the floor. Jake didn't flinch. Stay with me, Ava, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the roaring chaos of the cave. Look at me. That's it. Breathe. Good. He worked in silence for several minutes, securing a pressure bandage, his movements economic and precise. He saw the way she watched him, her eyes wide with pain and a strange, vulnerable trust. This close, he could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She wasn't just a ranger, not just an ally. She was a fighter, and she was hurt because of him. Why? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the waterfall's roar. Why what? He asked, his hands busy taping the bandage. Why go back? She mumbled, her mind drifting from shock and pain. The container. You had the GPS. You could have just left. Called it in from Pittsburgh. Why go back for those drives? Jake stopped taping for a moment. He looked at the silver hard case lying on the cave floor and then at her. I'm on leave, Ava, he said quietly. Mandatory. They said I needed to disconnect, that I was getting too close to the fight, that I'd forgotten why we fight. He secured the bandage. I came up here to find some quiet. Instead, I found this. And I realized they were right. I had forgotten. It all just became about the mission, about the objective, just noise. He met her gaze, his own eyes holding a deep, quiet pain. This is the first time in years it hasn't been noise. This is clear. This is simple. You're fighting for your father's name, for your home. I'm fighting because, well, a man like Reed doesn't get to win. Not here. Not while we're here to stop him. Ava watched him, a deep, silent understanding passing between them. In the wet, cold, roaring cave, two lonely people, both pushed to their limits, had found a common purpose that was stronger than fear. Jake checked her pulse. It was weak and fast. Her skin was clammy. Ava, you're breathing. Is it getting harder? She tried to take a deep breath and winced, a rattling sound in her chest. It's tight. Cold. Jake's blood ran cold. The shrapnel. It must have nicked her lung. The ice water, the shock. She was going into respiratory distress. He looked at the wound. He'd stopped the bleeding, but he couldn't fix the internal damage. She needed a hospital. She needed an extraction. Now. The time for stealth was over. Hiding would kill her. I have to make the call, he said, his voice grim. It's a risk. Thorn is out there. They'll be listening. But you don't have a choice, we don't. She just nodded, her eyes trusting him. Jake grabbed his go bag and pulled out the precious silver hard case and his satellite phone. His hands were shaking, but not from cold, from anger. He was pinned, his partner was wounded, and he was being forced to expose his position. He powered on the phone. The small screen lit up, searching for a signal. He plugged one of the hard drives into a port on the phone's case, a feature designed for this exact purpose, rapid data extraction. He found the smallest, most critical-looking file, a ledger, names, dates, shipments. Got it, he whispered. He attached the file to an encrypted emergency message to his SEAL command. U.S. asset engaged. Hostile force AD, deniable ops. Ranger down, critical. Requesting immediate evac in QRF. Data attached. He added the coordinates. He hit send. The phone screen read, uploading. The roar of the waterfall masked all other sounds. Jake watched the progress bar. His entire body was coiled like a spring. Upload complete. It's done, he said, a wave of relief washing over him. They're coming, Ava. Just hold on. He didn't even have time to power down the phone. Ruger, who had been a silent statue, suddenly rose. A growl so deep it made Jake's teeth vibrate. And it wasn't aimed at the cave entrance. It was aimed up. A new sound cut through the waterfall's roar. A heavy, rhythmic whump 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 that Jake knew as well as his own heartbeat. Rotors. But it was too fast. His team was hours away. He crawled to the edge of the waterfall and peered through the spray. His heart stopped. It wasn't a military Black Hawk. It was a sleek, black civilian helicopter, an Augusta Westland, the kind billionaires use. It was coming down, its landing lights cutting through the twilight, setting down on the clear, rocky riverbank not 50 yards from their hiding spot. They hadn't just been listening. They'd been waiting for his signal. They'd tracked the call. The side door slid open. Two figures emerged. One was Thorn, soaked and furious. The other was an older man, tall and elegant, even on a muddy riverbank. He wore an expensive wool coat, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He looked at the waterfall, his expression calm, as if he were looking at a piece of real estate. Donovan Reed had come to collect his property. The roar of the waterfall was a deafening, vibrating curtain of sound, but the heavy thud of helicopter skids hitting the rocky riverbank cut through it. Jake pressed Ava back against the rear wall of the shallow cave, his body shielding hers. Ruger stood before them, a low, menacing growl originating deep in his chest, his eyes locked on the watery entrance. The engine spooled down, plunging them back into the roar of the falls. A shadow blocked the gray light. Two men stepped through the spray. The first was Cade Thorn, his tactical gear dripping, his face a mask of cold fury. His rifle was up, his movements fluid and deadly. The second man was immaculate. Donovan Reed, tall and silver-haired, brushed a few droplets of water from the sleeve of his expensive wool coat. He looked into the cave, his expression one of pure annoyance, as if he'd found an insect in his boardroom. Well, Reed said, his voice a calm, cultured baritone that carried easily. This has been a profoundly inconvenient day, Senior Chief Callahan, I presume. Jake remained silent, his hand on Ruger's neck, applying steady pressure. He was a compressed spring. You've caused me a great deal of trouble, you know, Reed continued, stepping fully into the cave. Thorn flanked him, the single red laser dot from his rifle dancing on Jake's chest. And you, Ranger Garcia, your father was a nuisance. And you, it seems, are a carbon copy. He just didn't have the good sense to stop digging. He should have just enjoyed his retirement. You killed him, Ava whispered, her voice weak with pain. The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Reed actually laughed, a short, mirthless sound. My dear girl, I don't kill anyone. I solve problems. Your father was a problem. The two fools in the container were a problem. And you, Senior Chief, you are the biggest problem of all. You were supposed to be a ghost, a small fire on a hillside. Why, Reed? Jake's voice was low, controlled. He was buying time. His team was coming. They had the signal. He just had to keep this man talking. What is all this for? You have billions. You have Aegis Dynamics. You see weapons, Reed said with a dismissive wave. I see order. I see the future. Those men in the container stole from me, sold my proprietary technology. They thought they were clever, but nobody steals from me. The weapons you found were obsolete. I was simply cleaning house. Until you and your dog decided to go digging in my trash. He looked at Thorn. Cade, Retrieve the case. Then solve the problem, both of them, and the dog. Thorne nodded, his rifle still trained on Jake, and took a step forward. Jake, Ava whispered, her voice tight with pain. She was fumbling for something at her belt, her movements hidden by the jacket he'd laid over her. Jake saw it. Her hand was on her Ranger-issue flare gun. She was too weak. Her shoulder was immobile, but her eyes locked on his, filled with a desperate, defiant fire. Thorne was 10 feet away. The case, Senior Chief. Jake's mind raced. The Black Hawks would be loud. They would be fast. But they weren't here yet. He had to make his own opening. He looked at Thorne. He looked at Reed. Then he locked eyes with Ruger. He gave a nearly imperceptible signal, a twitch of his fingers on the dog's neck. "It's over, Callahan." "Give it to me," Thorne ordered. "You're right," Jake said. "It is." He gave the final command, a single, sharp word. "Breach." Ruger exploded out of the shadows. He wasn't a dog. He was a 70-pound missile of focused rage. He didn't go for the throat. He went for the weapon. Ruger hit Thorne in the chest, his jaws locking on the rifle, twisting with all his might. Thorne screamed, a sound of pure surprise as he was thrown off balance. The rifle discharged, the suppressed rounds thudding harmlessly into the cave floor. Jake moved simultaneously. He launched himself out of the darkness, not at Thorne, but at Reed. He grabbed the billionaire, using him as a human shield, his arm locking around Reed's throat. Thorne threw Ruger off him with a powerful shove. The dog hit the rock wall, but was instantly back on his feet, snarling, driving in again. Thorne raised his rifle. He never got the chance. Jake, holding Reed, slammed his own pistol against Thorne's temple. The operator crumpled, his training no match for the raw, desperate speed of the attack. Reed, gasping, fumbled inside his coat and produced a small, silver pistol. He pressed it to Jake's head. "Jake!" Ava screamed. Her voice was the distraction. As Reed's head turned, Ava, with her single good arm, raised the flare gun and pulled the trigger. Whoosh! A brilliant red star shot out of the cave, aimed not at Reed, but at the open door of his helicopter. The magnesium flare slammed into the cockpit's control panel. For a second, nothing happened. Then, flammable hydraulic fluid and electronics ignited. A muffled thump erupted from the chopper. The turbine, starved of its control systems, shrieked and died. A thick, acrid black smoke began to pour from the cabin. "No!" Reed screamed, his composure shattering, watching his escape route become a pyre. And in that moment, a new sound arrived. A sound that, to Jake, was the most beautiful in the world. A deep, thunderous, chopping whump 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 that drowned out the waterfall, the fire, and Reed's screams. Two massive, dark shapes, Navy Black Hawk helicopters, crested the canyon ridge, their searchlights flaring to life, bathing the entire riverbank in brilliant white light. On the ground. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "This is the United States Navy. Put your weapons on the ground now." Jake threw Reed into the mud and kicked the silver pistol away. He stood, his chest heaving as a dozen figures, dark and professional, fast roped from the helicopters. They flooded the scene, a wave of controlled, disciplined force. They cuffed a stunned, sputtering Donovan Reed. They cuffed the unconscious Thorne. A pararescue jumper immediately slid into the cave, his helmet light finding Ava. "Ma'am, I'm here to help. What's your name?" "Ava," she whispered, the flare gun falling from her hand. Dawn was breaking. The gray pre-dawn light mixed with the blue and red strobes from the helicopters and the orange flicker of Reed's burning aircraft. The air smelled of ozone, river water, and smoke. Jake stood back, letting the medics work. He was bruised, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, but he felt a deep, absolute calm. They put Ava on a spine board, a litter. The medic had already started in 4, her arm now properly splinted. As they carried her from the cave, Jake walked beside her. He took his jacket, the one she had given him from her father, and tucked it around her. "You did good, Ranger," he said quietly. Ruger limped over, his side bruised where Thorne had kicked him. He nudged his head against Ava's hand on the litter. She weakly turned her fingers and buried them in his thick fur. A SEAL officer, Jake's commander, approached, holding the silver hard case. "That's one way to spend your leave, Senior Chief. Good work." "Just getting some fresh air, sir," Jake replied. The medic carrying Ava's litter paused at the helicopter door. "She's stable. We're taking her to UPMC Presbyterian in Pittsburgh. Are you riding along, Senior Chief?" Jake looked at Ava. Her eyes were closed, but she was breathing evenly. He looked at Ruger, sitting panting at his feet. He looked at Reed, being led in cuffs to the other helicopter. The war had come home, and he had met it. He looked back at the medic, then at Ava. "Right behind you," he said. He leaned closer so only she could hear. "I'm not leaving Pittsburgh until you're back on your feet." He wasn't sure, but he thought he saw the faint trace of a smile on her lips. Jake and Ruger stood on the riverbank, the rotor wash whipping at them, and watched the helicopter lift off, carrying her to safety. The sun finally cleared the canyon wall, hitting Jake's face. The mountains were quiet again, but it was a new kind of quiet. It wasn't empty. It was earned.